Hello everyone, my name is Gary Griffin and I'm here to read this afternoon my time, from my new book, 6 Bullets. It's available on Amazon. That's where you can go and do a search on Gary W. Griffin, 6 Bullets, but I'm going to be reading to you out of chapter 1, The World That Cannot Decide. The year did not feel like the future. It felt like a backlog. People still walked under sky. Cargo still moved on schedule. Lights still turned on when commanded. The machines did their work with dutiful patience that now seemed like the last remaining civic virtue. But above the movement, above the services and the transit lanes and the municipal drones that polished glass facades that no one looked up to admire, there hung a huge sense of stalled instructions, like a city holding its breath because no one could agree on whether to inhale. In 2236, civilization had learned how to survive without consensus, the way a wounded body learns to function around a dead nerve. It rerouted, it compensated, it automated, it reduced everything that required human agreement into smaller and smaller units until agreement became manageable again, or until the scale of decision matched the narrowness of shared belief. That was the new social contract. You could have your truth as long as it stayed local. The rest of the world ran on provisional settings. On a public wall in the Midtown Concourse, a voting panel displayed the week's open motions in small gray type. Each issue was tagged with the same administrative mark that had become as common as street signs. Deferred. Deferred because the Bioethics Coalition had failed a jurisdictional challenge. Deferred because the city-states refused to recognize the legitimacy of the committee. Deferred because the language of the motion was found to contain implicit bias. Deferred because two groups submitted mutually exclusive definitions of the word harm. Deferred because there were 6 different legal interpretations of what constituted consent. The panel updated every 15 seconds. It never looked different. People passed it without slowing. They had learned not to stare at paralysis. It was like staring at rot. It made the stomach turn, and then eventually it stopped doing even that. The human body, like the human mind, found ways to make peace with the slow failure. Elias Rowan watched the panel anyway because it was his job to do. It was his job to watch what everyone else trained themselves to ignore. He stood with his hands behind his back in the posture of a man who had been taught that stillness could be a form of authority. His uniform was unremarkable, with gray fabric designed to avoid being read as aggressive. The insignia stitched so flat it seemed apologetic. His badge did not say police. The word had become too loud in certain districts. It said metropolitan stability, in a font that looked like it had been chosen by a committee afraid of sharp edges. Rowan's eyes moved across the deferred motions the way another man might read a list of casualties. He did not expect resolution. He had stopped expecting it years ago. What he wanted was something smaller and more immediate, a sign that the system still recognized cause and effect. A woman in a pale jacket approached him from the right, walking fast enough to suggest outrage, but not so fast that it became a scene. Outrage in 2236 was common currency. The problem was always what it purchased. "Officer," she said. Rowan corrected her gently. "Stability." She looked at him as if the distinction itself was evidence of collapse. "Stability, then. I need you to come with me to the south corridor. Now." Rowan did not move. "What is the issue?" "The corridor is blocked." Rowan waited. People often stopped speaking too soon, as if stating a problem was equivalent to stating its solution. "Blocked by what?" he said. "By them," she jerked her chin toward the flow of pedestrians at the far end of the concourse. "By their stupid barrier, by their stupid right to install it." Rowan's gaze followed the implied accusation. The concourse was wide, bright, and engineered to be neutral. an intentional attempt in the shared space in a city that no longer trusted shared anything. The South Corridor led to the triage clinics and the transport terminals. It was one of the few routes still designated as critical infrastructure. In the distance, he saw it, a new partition panel, one of those modular walls that could be unfolded in minutes and made to look like it had always belonged there. It cut across the corridor with bureaucratic perfection. A printed notice was affixed at eye level. Temporary access restriction, authorized under Local Community Self-Determination Act, Section 11.4, Cultural Protection Zones. Beneath the notice, a group of citizens stood with arms folded, wearing bright cloth bands on their wrist, a signal of affiliation. They weren't shouting, they didn't need to. The barrier did the shouting for them. People were forced to detour around it, their annoyance compressed into a narrow stream. Rowan's face remained controlled, but something in his chest tightened. Not anger exactly, but the familiar ache of a system that had learned how to justify its own strangulation. Who installed it, he asked. The Protection Zone Committee, the woman said. They're blocking the corridor to keep us from contaminating their space. My father can't get to his clinic appointment. The detour adds 12 minutes and he can't walk that far. Rowan turned his head slightly, scanning for other signals. There were always other committees. At the far side of the concourse, a small group held placards. Their wristbands were a different color. One side read, "Access is a civic right." Another, "No private walls and public paths." Rowan took in the scene with the practiced eye of a man trained to see the contours of escalation, the way bodies clustered, the way phones were raised, the way certain expressions weren't yet violence but were rehearsing for it. He had seen the pattern in 100 places, from zoning disputes to language regulation to water allocation. Each conflict dressed itself in new symbols, but the structure was always the same. Two groups claiming moral necessity, each insisting that yielding meant extinction. The city had at one time created a mechanism for disputes like this, an emergency override procedure that would allow critical routes to remain open. But the procedure required agreement among 6 oversight bodies, and the oversight bodies required the consent of their constituencies, and the constituencies required definitions of words that had become undefinable. No one could authorize authority anymore. Rowan began walking toward the barrier. The woman hurried beside him. "You'll remove it." "I'll assess it," he said. "That's not good enough. This is the South Corridor." I understand, Rowan's voice stayed even because he understood something else too. The moment he promised an outcome, he would become the conflict's newest target. As they approached, the group at the barrier straightened. Their expressions were not hostile, but they were prepared. Preparation was the new form of citizenship, a constant readiness to defend one's boundaries, physical or ideological. A man with a neatly trimmed beard stepped forward. His wristband was the same bright color as the others. "Stability officer," he said, emphasizing the title as if it were a test. "This is a protected zone. You have no authority here." Rowan stepped a respectful distance away. "This is a designated critical corridor," he said. "Medical access must remain unobstructed." The man smiled faintly. "Critical according to which authority?" Rowan had no answer that would satisfy the question. He could cite an ordinance, and the ordinance would be contested. He could cite a precedent, and the precedent would be labeled oppressive. He could cite a human need, and the human need would be translated into the language of power. He chose instead the one thing he could still use, the nearest form of truth. "A patient is being delayed," he said. 12 minutes. "Not our problem," someone behind the man said. The woman beside Rowan bristled. "Not your problem." The man held up a hand as if calming an animal. We sympathize," he said, "but this corridor passes through a space we've designated as culturally sensitive." We are tired of being treated as an inconvenience. Rowan nodded once, acknowledging the sentence without endorsing it. Is there an alternative configuration that would preserve your zone without blocking access? The man's eyes narrowed. He was unused to being asked for compromise in a world that treated compromise as betrayal. We offered compromise, he said. We offered time windows. The access rights group rejected them. Because you proposed windows that would make their clinic unusable, someone from the other side shouted. Rowan felt the air tighten as voices began to overlap. The old world, Rowan thought, had believed the greatest threat was violence. The old world had designated institutions to prevent it through laws, courts, and police. But the new world had discovered a threat that institutions were not designed to restrain. Refusal to agree on the legitimacy of restraint. This was what you got when even boundary became sacred and every shared space became suspect. Rowan tried again. Careful, this corridor is not your private property. The man's smile vanished. It isn't yours either. There it was, the sentence that ended most of Rowan's efforts. In the absence of shared authority, every intervention became tyranny by definition. The stability apparatus could no longer compel. It could only mediate, and mediation required the parties to accept the mediator. Rowan turned slightly, scanning the surrounding faces. Phones were recording. That too was governance now, documentation without resolution, evidence gathered not to decide but to perform allegiance. He imagined what would happen if he reached out and folded the barrier panel back into its stored position. He could do it in seconds. The panels were designed to be easily moved, but the ease was the trap. One small act of enforcement would become the spark for 1,000 narratives. Oppression, protection, violence, defense. The words would be deployed like weapons, each side choosing its own. Rowan's hand hovered for a fraction of a moment. Then it fell back to his side. He did what he had been trained to do in the era after consensus collapse. He initiated procedure. File your claim, he told the barrier group. File the formal authorization code for the restriction. We already filed, the man said. With which body? With his own committee, approved under local self-determination. Rowan looked toward the far wall where a terminal was embedded. One of those public access consoles that used to display city announcements and now serve mostly as an interface for committees to broadcast their latest declarations. He walked to the terminal and tapped in the request. A list appeared. Zone Committee, Active Access Rights Council, active. Critical Infrastructure Oversight, deferred. Health Mobility Authority, contested. Public Space Governance Panel, disputed. Interim Resolution Body, dissolved. Rowan stared at the last entry longer than the others. Dissolved. The Interim Resolution Body had once been the city's attempt at an override, a mechanism to make decisions in emergencies when regular governance could not. It had lasted 3 years before being labeled undemocratic and dismantled by popular demand. Rowan remembered the hearings. He remembered them as theater that had mistaken itself for truth. The chamber had been bright, overlit in the name of transparencies. The microphones had been turned to pick up every tremor in the voice, as if emotional fidelity could substitute for institutional clarity. The Interim Resolution Body sat behind a long desk with nameplates that looked temporary even then. The ink too clean, the titles too new. Behind them, a screen displayed the mandate language designed to soothe suspicion. Temporary Emergency Authority, limited scope, sunset required. A sunset clause had become the modern talisman. People did not trust power unless it promised to die. The first witness had been pragmatic. Hospital administrators, transit engineers, clinic directors. They described delays in the way professionals described injuries, precise, without melodrama, trusting that the reality would be self-evident if stated plainly. 12 minutes here, 7 there, a corridor rerouted. A triage queue backed up into an escalator bay. Not catastrophe as spectacle, catastrophe as accumulation. Then the next witnesses arrived, and the language changed. A woman with a wristband of now defunct coalition spoke of historical extraction and institutional violence, and she did not mean metaphor. A man in a polished jacket invoked self-determination as if it were a wound and a weapon at once. Someone else stood and read a statement about consent, and half the room booed because consent meant one thing to them and something else to everyone else. Words that had once been shared tools now function as border walls. Rowan remembered the moment the hearing shifted from policy to theology. An elder in the back row stood without waiting to be recognized. "You want an override," he said, voice steady. "You want to build a machine for deciding because you are afraid to live with disagreement." Rowan wanted to answer, not defensively, not angrily, just precisely. That disagreement was not their enemy, paralysis was. Those emergencies did not wait for interpretive alignment. That a city could die politely while it argued about the definition of harm. But he had watched the room and understood the trap. Any defense of authority would be translated into hunger for control. Any appeal to shared necessity would be accused of erasure. And if he spoke, he would not be heard as a person making an argument. He would be heard as a system attempting to preserve itself. He stayed silent. Silence had been his compromise with a public that treated compromise as surrender. He remembered how citizens had spoken of autonomy with the fierce pride of survivors. He remembered how his own silence, because he had known that arguing for decision-making authority was like arguing for a return to monarchy in a world that had forgotten why monarchies were despised. Now he watched the corridor remain blocked, and he felt a familiar sensation settle over him like dust, the weight of a system that could not move because it had been designed to prevent moving in the wrong direction, and then had decided that all directions were wrong. The woman beside him spoke again, her voice tight. "So you're not going to do anything?" Rowan looked at her. Her anger was not abstract. It had a father attached to it. 12 minutes was a number. Pain was the thing the number covered. "I'm going to open a temporary medical lane," he said. "How?" Rowan turned back toward the barrier group. "You will move the panel 3 feet to the left," he said, "just enough for one wheelchair." The man's expression hardened. "No." Rowan held his gaze. "One lane," he repeated, as if repetition could build authority. "No." Rowan felt the crowd's attention sharpen. Phones lifted a fraction higher. He could feel the city itself leaning in, not with hope, but with appetite, a hunger for conflict to break the monotony of deferral. Rowan took a breath. Not to calm himself, he wasn't afraid, but to slow the moment before it became irreversible. "Why not?" he asked. The man's reply was immediate, practiced. Because the lane becomes precedent, precedent becomes erosion, erosion becomes disappearance. Rowan almost smiled at the bleak elegance of the chain. That was the logic of 2236. Every concession was a slope. Every slope was a fall. He looked past the man to the faces behind him. They were not villains. They were not citizens. Their fear was real. Their need for protection was real, but their certainty was total. And certainty had become a kind of quiet violence. Rowan could not solve this in a corridor. He could not solve it in a day. He could not solve it in a lifetime. He chose the only tool left, postponement. "I'm escalating this," he said. "To whom?" the woman snapped. Rowan did not answer because the question had no correct reply. He stepped away from the barrier and began to walk, his movements controlled. He felt the woman's anger behind him like heat. He felt the barrier of group satisfaction. He felt the access rights protesters discussed. This was work now, to be hated by every side for refusing to choose a side. Rowan moved through the concourse as the third panel continued its soft mechanical updates. In the corner of his vision, a public news ribbon scrolled across the wall display, its font calm, its content destabilizing. Global Coordination Summit postponed, lack of agreement on agenda terms. Arctic water sharing accord stalled over definitions of scarcity. Orbital mining consortiums halts operations. Liability framework contested. He read these without surprise. The planet had become a federation of stalled intentions. Even the off-world settlements now mirrored Earth's pathology. Progress suspended not by catastrophe, but by interpretive dispute. Then another appeared, Metropolitan Stability Officer, unreachable, Sector 12. Transport route error under review. Rowan slowed but did not stop. Unreachable. The word was deliberately neutral. It did not say missing, it did not say taking, it did not say failure. It implied technical inconvenience. A second line followed moments later. Public safety mediator unresponsive. River district. Network outage suspected. Rowan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Two incidents did not make a pattern. In 2236, systems misfired constantly. Authority conflicts corrupted routing protocols. Committee overrides interfered with priority lanes. Still, he watched the ribbon longer than usual. A third notice slid into view. Infrastructure Arbitration Officer. Status unknown. Last route priority transfer. The phrase caught. Priority transfer. Rowan felt something subtle align in his mind. Not alarm, not yet, but orientation. The brain's quiet assembling of fragments. He checked his wrist unit. Dispatch traffic was unusually thin. He keyed a query into the municipal grid. The request stalled. Access delayed. Authorization conflict. He did not attempt a second query. In 2236, the difference between coincidence and coordination was often invisible until after damage was complete. His wrist vibrated. Stability request, Sector 9, mediation. He stared at the message longer than the others had required. Sector 9 was volatile, but not anomalous. Committee proliferation was common. Mediation failures, routine. Still, he accepted the route. The transit capsule sailed around him with his usual quiet precision. The movement through the city was efficient. Machines still knew how to move bodies, even when humans cannot move decisions. As the capsule lifted, the city unfolded beneath him. Enclaves marked by subtle boundary glyphs, cultural protection zones, economic sovereignty blocks, ethical research exemptions, autonomous education corridors. Each fragment is governed well enough. Together they govern nothing. His wrist unit vibrated again. Stability request canceled. Sector 9, resolution body rejected. Rowan frowned. The cancellation timestamp preceded the acceptance timestamp. He checked again. The dispatch log flickered. 3 additional entries appeared briefly, then vanished. Transfer error, route reassigned. Transfer error, route reassigned. Transfer error, route reassigned. His breath remained steady, but something with him shifted from observation to readiness. The capsule hummed. The lights flickered once, not dramatically, not enough to cause panic, just enough to suggest an instruction had been overwritten. Rowan looked around. The other passengers were calm, or performing calmly. Then the capsule's tone changed. It was subtle, lower. Route adjustment, priority transfer. The words appeared on the display in soft gray. Rowan did not move at first. Priority transfer required authorization. Authorization required concurrence among 3 oversight nodes. Unless the request originated from a level above oversight, he attempted to access the routing protocol. No signal. He tried again. No network. He was not alone in the capsule, but he felt singularly isolated. He checked the public news ribbon embedded in the interior display. It refreshed. 5 names scrolled past in small official type. Stability officer, Sector 12, unreachable. Public safety mediator, River District, unresponsive. Infrastructure arbitration, status unknown. Critical access liaison, no signal. Mobility oversight analyst, route error. Rowan's pulse did not spike, it narrowed. He understood now, not because the pattern was loud, because it was symmetrical. 5 within 12 hours, all governance adjacent, all routed through transport, all described in language designed to avoid the word disappearance. The capsule banked sharply, leaving the primary transit corridor. The city lights thinned. He realized with quiet precision that this was not a malfunction. This was a decision. The capsule descended into an unmarked bay. The doors opened. No personnel, no signage. The capsule departed without him. Rowan stood alone in the corridor, engineered to erase orientation. His wrist unit displayed nothing. He began walking. With each step, the pattern clarified. 5 others, each drawn from different mediation strata, not military, not political heads, not committee leaders. Intermediaries, bridges, people whose functions were not to rule, function was not to rule, but to translate, to hold the thin line between incompatible truths. The world could not decide. Someone had removed the deciders or the would-be deciders, the only one still attempting to construct shared reality. He reached the door. It opened. The room was symmetrical. A table, 6 chairs. The number registered instantly, not abstractly, structurally. 6. On the wall, the display lit. Welcome, participant 4. Participant, not detainee, not subject. Participant implied consent, or the illusion of it. Rowan's eyes moved to the table. The revolver rested at its center. He recognized it immediately. He had logged it into storage 3 years ago after the Oversight Harmonization Act reduced armament protocols for stability officers. It should have been in a municipal locker, not here. He counted the chairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 5 missing, 1 present. He was the 6th. His mind attempted one final reconciliation. Perhaps the others were elsewhere. Perhaps this was not coordinated. Then the display changed. 5 additional identifiers appeared beneath his. Participant 1 arrived. Participant 2 arrived. Participant 3 arrived. Participant 5 arrived. Participant 6 arrived. His designation remained 4. The numbering was not chronological. It was positional, assigned, chosen. The room's hum deepened. The same subaudible frequency threaded the air. His jaw ached faintly. The display shifted again. Please be seated. Rowan did not move. He felt for the first time in years the sensation of being inside a system that did not require committee approval to function. A system that had already reconciled its internal contradictions. A system that did not defer. His vision softened at the edges. He tried to step back. His legs responded a fraction too late. The room tilted, not violently, but decisively. His last coherent thought was not fear, it was comprehension. The city could not decide, the planet could not decide, the councils could not define their terms long enough to act, so something else had defined them. 6 intermediaries, 6 translators. 6 bridges between incompatible worlds, removed in less than 24 hours, not to eliminate paralysis, but to force decision. Darkness folded over him. When Rowan's eyes opened again, the room was brighter. The revolver was still on the table, and the chairs were no longer empty. Chapter 1, 6 Bullets. Get your copy today at Amazon.com.